Well, welcome, everybody. This is the October 18th, 2021 Finance Committee meeting. And for those of you who are on the Zoom meeting, we'll have this Finance Committee meeting first, and then the City Council meeting will follow. In talking with the director, we have quite a bit to talk about for the Finance Committee. So we're targeting about an hour for the Finance Committee, and then probably looking around 7:30 or so to end, have maybe a short break, and then start the City Council meeting. So if you want to have a cup of coffee and wait for the City Council meeting, that's fine. But we have a lot to talk about tonight. First, I'd like to read a brief announcement, which is, please be advised that all of the City Council Finance Committee members will be remotely attending this meeting by electronic means in compliance with the recent amendments of the Open Meetings Act. The mayor of the City Council has determined that it's not prudent or practical to conduct an in-person meeting due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's not feasible to have the City Council members or members of the public physically present at the meeting due to the pandemic. So thank you very much. Director Holub, would you call the roll?
Certainly, thank you. Mayor Pantaleon?
Here.
Chairman Morris?
Here.
Alderman Karas?
Here.
Alderman Rummel?
Here.
Alderman Notes?
Yep.
Alderman Preschlack?
Here.
Alderman Gushgarian?
Here.
Alderman Bushman?
Here.
And Alderman Weber.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. The first item is a consideration of minutes from our prior City Finance Committee meeting held July 19th, 2021. Does anyone have any questions or comments on those meeting minutes? If not, we would need a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second? Very good. Director, would you take a roll call on the
Of
vote?
course, Mayor Pantaleon?
Aye.
Chairman Morris?
Aye.
Alderman Karas?
Aye.
Alderman Rummel?
Aye.
Alderman Notes?
Aye.
Alderman Preschlack?
Aye.
Alderman Gushgarian?
Aye.
Alderman Bushman?
Aye.
Alderman Weber?
Aye.
Motion approved unanimously.
Thank you, everyone. The next item, we're going to switch to Director Holub. She'll be providing us with a slide presentation, PowerPoint presentation. It'll take us through a lot of the items that are left on the agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to Director Holub to jump into her presentation.
Thank you. I just want to make sure everyone can see the slides.
Yep.
Okay, great. The first item on the agenda this evening begins the official review and approval of fiscal year 23 budget related items.
Elizabeth, before you go, can you make your slide full? Because you have down on the left-hand side, you have the deck, and given the size of the print, can you make yours full screen?
I did. I just had it on the wrong, looks like it's on the wrong monitor, Joe.
I said, because we went through this earlier, and the print can get kind of small in these slides. So the bigger we can make it, the better.
If you can try stop sharing and then try to reshare again.
Okay. You'd think by now we would have all this figured out.
Right. No.
Yeah, I have it. I'm gonna.
Thanks, everybody, for your patience.
Yes,
Those on
thank
the
you very
line.
much. All right.
No.
How's
Ah,
that?
very good.
All right, we're there. Thank
Well
you.
done. Yes.
So as I mentioned, the first item on the agenda this evening is mission statement and fiscal year 23 fiscal policy. These really begin the first approval and recommended approvals related to the fiscal year 23 budget. And these items appear on the Finance Committee agenda each October as a beginning or a launching off point for our budget. The mission statement is included here on the slide, was included in your packet. This mission statement was approved by the Finance Committee in 2013 and each year has been affirmed. So the first item we would request this evening is for Finance Committee approval of the mission statement.
So moved.
Second.
Director Al, do we need a vote on this one?
I think we do. Mayor
Okay.
Pantaleon.
Aye.
Chairman Morris.
Aye.
Alderman Karas.
Aye.
Alderman Rummel.
Aye.
Alderman Notes.
Aye.
Alderman Preschlack.
Aye.
Alderman Gashgarian.
Aye.
Alderman Bushman.
Aye.
And Alderman Weber.
Aye.
Great. That motion is approved. Thank you. The next item related to this is the fiscal year 23 fiscal policy. The City Council fiscal policy sets forth the framework and foundation on which the annual budget is prepared by staff and brought to the City Council for review each year. The fiscal policy, the complete fiscal policy was included in your packet. And just highlighted on this slide are the three specific changes that staff is recommending for your consideration this year. The first item relates to the reserve policies, and the reserve in the general fund has been an item of discussion by the Finance Committee and City Council for the last few years. You can see at the beginning of this paragraph, the minimum target fund balance in the general fund is 35% of revenues plus the accrued sick and vacation leave liability for all staff. In recent years, the city has allowed that fund balance to increase for a number of reasons. First was the economic conditions in 2008 and 2009, which impacted revenues in the city's general fund, but also the increasing concern about the state of Illinois' fiscal condition and the potential for them to reduce state shared revenue or impose property tax limitations that would impact the revenue generating capability of the city. So over the last few years, we have targeted the fund balance as of April 30th, 2018 as the minimum fund balance in the general fund. And as you know, the City Council has authorized in each subsequent year transfers of the operating surplus out of the general fund into other funds for specific purposes, much of that going into the capital improvement fund to supplement the 5-year capital improvement program. The concern by staff is that setting this target based on a dollar amount from 4/30/2018, that percentage calculation is going to erode over time as revenues naturally grow each year. So the suggested revision to this policy is to add an additional sentence at the end of that paragraph that indicates the city will seek to maintain a general fund reserve of 70% of revenues plus accrued sick and vacation leave. I would note that the city currently exceeds that 70%. And this isn't a recommendation to reduce it to 70%, but it is a recommendation to make that target percentage-based rather than dollar amount based, with that percentage eroding over time. The second recommendation relates to the fund balance target of the Water and Sewer Enterprise Fund capital. The Capital Improvements Fund has a minimum fund balance requirement of $1 million. We have set this target in the Water and Sewer Capital Fund of 0% for a number of years, but the staff recommendation is to implement a minimum reserve of $1 million, similar to the Capital Improvement Fund, to ensure that funds are available should there be an unforeseen circumstance that requires immediate funding. The current fund balance in this fund is over $2.5 million, so it does not require any change going forward, but we're just recommending that there be a minimum fund balance in that fund. And then the last recommended change is an addition under the debt policies. This is just reflecting current practice. Over the last several years, the SEC has required increasing requirements for municipal bond issuers. And we work with our bond counsel, Chapman and Cutler, to make sure that the city is in compliance with all of those matters. But in the event the city is ever asked whether or not we have a policy, we could point to this statement in the fiscal policy that indicates that the finance director is responsible for working with bond counsel to ensure that all post-issuance compliance matters are maintained and occur. So those are the 3 staff recommendations. I'm happy to answer any questions or assist with any discussion on the staff recommendations.
Sure, we can open up. Just as a precursor, Director Hubble and I have talked about this, and I think these are prudent recommendations for what we're trying to do, but certainly open up for questions about the policy from members. Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Holub, because we're talking about an enterprise fund, are we bound in any way in terms of if we find that that fund continues to grow and we don't need to use it for emergency purposes, are we allowed to sweep that from the enterprise fund into the CIP?
We cannot do that, Alderman Gashgarian, because it is based on water and sanitary sewer usage charges, and because it is established as an enterprise fund, we're very limited on the amount of revenue that can come out of that fund into another city operating fund. The one exception I would note is that there is an administrative services charge paid by the water and sewer fund to the general fund each year to support their allocation of general staff resources of the general departments, human resources, IT, finance, those types of things. So we do make that transfer each year, but we would not be able to reallocate those dollars to non-water or sanitary sewer projects.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alderman Notes?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm curious, are there any policies that limit accruing sick or vacation time? Or there's just no cap at all?
Right. Alderman Notes, there is a limitation. Specifically, vacation is for most employees, 240 hours can be carried over from one year to another. Once a year, that limit is reviewed and vacation leave balances are reduced if anyone exceeds that threshold. There are some sick limits, but what we accrue as sick leave liability is only that portion of the sick balance that an employee would be eligible for payment of upon separation, and that is very limited.
Okay. And just so I'm clear in terms of what role that cap that you mentioned of 240 hours, is that a absolute cap, or that I'm just trying to think through, there's no opportunity that would necessarily be increased unless it was reviewed annually or whatnot?
There is an opportunity for department heads to recommend exceptions to that rollover for extenuating circumstances. So if, for example, operations in a particular department prevented employees from being able to take their vacation leave, they can request an extension, but it is usually for a limited number of months so that they use it quickly and then they get back under the cap.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Other questions? Let's see, Alderman Bushman. I'm rotating screens back and forth here. Alderman Bushman.
Elizabeth, we had talked a little bit earlier today, or exchanged emails on the first change you have there of setting a 70% reserve limit, or goal, as I'll call it. And the question whether, we're underfunding or overfunding it. But you mentioned one of the reasons of doing it is to move away from a specific dollar amount, which can erode over time, obviously. But to what extent does that first sentence in that reserve policy, paragraph 2, where we talk about the 35% minimum, was that viewed as a floor that we were always operating under for this general fund?
Yes, initially it was actually before that 25%. And then I don't recall off the top of my head what year that the city adjusted it to 35%. But then intentionally after the 2008-2009 economic, depression and reductions in revenues and the city's early retirement incentive that reduced a number of personnel in 2011 and 2012, the city each year allowed those budget surpluses in the general fund to accumulate and increase reserves due to the concerns I mentioned earlier.
And the other question I had asked you, and you had provided the answer, which I think would be interesting to the entire council, what sort of reserve fund goals do comparable municipalities have in terms of comparing to the 70% figure that you're looking for here?
Certainly. Thank you, Alderman Bushman. Yes, in 2019, we did a survey of AAA rated communities in Illinois on a couple different metrics. So I went back to that, and revenues or cash reserves as a percentage of revenues was one of the factors, and the average of the 13 units of government that was AAA in 2019 was 66%.
Thank you. And I guess one other point that to make sure we all understand it is a question that was asked earlier in an earlier meeting. What sort of return do we get on the reserve funds? And I think what I heard was a little disappointing, but could you share that?
Sure. And in fact, you'll actually see quite a bit of that later on in the agenda when we talk about the investment program. But right now, the city is earning 39 basis points, so 0.39%, less than 1% on deposits in the Lake Forest Bank and Trust account.
Thank you.
Alderman Rummel, I think you had a question?
Yes, yeah, I'm just following up on Alderman Gashgarian's question. So conversely, can we take money out of the general fund and put it into the water fund?
Yes, Alderman Rummel, we can, because the general fund is considered unrestricted funds, and so they can go towards any purpose that the council deems is warranted.
So perhaps that's why in the past we had the water fund balance at 0, because we could always transfer in funds from the general fund to cover any unexpected contingency.
Yeah, I think actually that the 0% was instituted initially because we have such a significant reserve requirement in the water and sewer operating fund. And so I believe that the thought was that if an unforeseen circumstance came up from a water and sanitary sewer capital requirement, we could use the operating fund reserves to support that expense. And so we're just simply recommending, since the fund balance is already over that amount, that we go ahead and establish a minimum in the capital fund as well as the operating fund for water and sewer. But you're right, you could use general fund reserves or even capital improvement fund dollars for a water or sanitary sewer project.
Very good. Other committee questions? All right, very good. Well, again, we need to have a motion to approve the fiscal 2023 fiscal policy. Motion from someone?
I move.
Right.
Second.
Second. Director Hobb, would you take the vote?
Certainly. Mayor Pantaleon,
Aye.
Chairman Morris,
Aye.
Alderman Karas,
Aye.
Alderman Rummel,
Aye.
Alderman Notes,
Aye.
Alderman Preschlack,
Aye.
Alderman Gashgarian,
Aye.
Alderman Bushman,
Aye.
Alderman Weber.
Aye.
Motion approved. Thank you.
Very good. The next item is I think a really good news story, but we're going to be talking about public safety pension funding. So Dr. Holub, all yours.
Thank you, Chairman Morris. First, to just kind of look from an overview standpoint, the police and fire pension funds receive an independent actuarial valuation. We use Foster & Foster each year. And that actuarial valuation provides us metrics such as the funded ratio for the plan, which is how much of the future actuarial liability is covered by assets existing in the plan currently, and the investment return, and also provides the city with the actuarially determined contribution requirement for the next year. So the 4/30/21 actuarial valuation gives you the numbers that are required for the 2021 property tax levy, and then subsequently the fiscal year 23 budget. So there is a bit of a time lag on the connection. This slide just shows you the funded ratio and investment return for both police and fire over the last 3 fiscal years. And what you will see is that the investment return has a great influence on the funded ratio of the plan. So in fiscal year 20, the investment returns were less than stellar, 0.48% for police and 2.57% for fire, which was well below our 6.5% investment return assumption. And so that resulted on the left side in a reduction in the funded ratios for both plans as of 4/30/20. The great news is we know that we received very significant investment returns for fiscal year 21, just under 26% for police and just under 28% for fire, which provided significant increases to the funded ratios, police moving from 48 to 59% funded, and fire from 64% to 78% funded. So the plans stand at 4/30/21 in a much better position than they did a year ago, which is great news. What is important to understand about the actuarial return and the actuarial valuation is that to minimize significant increases and decreases in funding requirements as a result of investment performance, the actuary utilizes 5-year smoothing of actual investment returns in determining the actuarially determined contribution requirements. So highlighted here is that in the police report, the police fund in fiscal year 21 earned just under $6.5 million above and beyond the 6.5% investment return assumption, essentially a gain towards the amortized liability, but that is spread out over 5 years. So 20% in 21, and then 20% will be realized in 22, 23, 24, and 25. So that allows more predictability and less volatility in the contribution requirement. What you see in the previous year in 2020, we came in about $2 million under the investment return assumption. And so that is amortized over 5 years as an add to the contribution requirement. Stepping back a few years ago, in 2016, the city really started having conversations about the challenges associated with public safety pension funding in Illinois. The blue line was the forecasted contribution requirements for police only. Fire is not represented here. The reason why we use police is because it's the lower funded plan. And so we'll see less dramatic changes, but similar trend curves for fire, but police gives us a better idea about financial impacts of different scenarios. So we had seen our contributions to the police pension fund grow from 1.38 million to 1.8 million for the May 1, 2016 valuation. And we were at the time working with a new actuary to gain a better understanding of how we might take a different approach to this funding requirement, recognizing that this ramp, which is really a result of statutory requirements, and all fire and police pension plans in Illinois look at a similar ramp because of the backloading and the structure of how police and fire pension contributions are calculated over time. In addition to the fact that statutes require 100%, well, statutes require 90% funding by 2040, at which point the contributions significantly drop because you've got your liability fully amortized, or at least 90% amortized, and then you drop down only to the normal cost. And so what has happened over time is that there was a 40-year amortization period from 1980 to 2020. In 1993, that 40-year period was started over. And so the new funding deadline was 2033. And then that amortization period was again extended to 2040. And so what has happened over time is that every time this 40-year clock resets, it goes back to lower contributions and creates a larger and larger problem for the future years. And so the city was really looking to look at alternatives to this funding requirement and look at ways to handle this more proactively and have a result different from this blue line. So in 2017, the City Council approved a number of changes. We updated the mortality table and changed the salary schedule, but more importantly, the payroll growth assumption was reduced from 5.5% to 2%, which significantly changes this trajectory of the ramp, but requires a significant increase in contributions immediately. So that change increased for police the contribution from 1.8 million to 2.5 million in the years 16 to 2017. So that increased contribution was budgeted in fiscal year 2019. You see here the subsequent contribution requirements using this model, the orange line, for the last few years. So the goal of this is to get ahead, have these increased contributions, earning dollars for the plan for a longer period of time, and reduce this significant ramp. So we started this in 2017. In 2019, we updated the modeler to see whether we were still on pace, which we were. And then we decided to update this modeler again in 2021 for two reasons. First, the council had made the extra $500,000 contribution in July of 2020, which was in addition to the contribution requirement. And then we had the stellar returns in fiscal year 21. So we wanted to see how that had changed the landscape going forward. So I'm very pleased to tell you that this is what we have accomplished to date. So as a result of the updated modeler as of 5/1/21, we are now looking at a funding line that is represented by the orange. And so those increased contribution requirements here have significantly and effectively reduced the ramp going forward to the 2040 funding deadline. So where we had looked in 2016 at contributions going from 1.8 million to just under 7.4 million, we are today looking at a 2021 contribution requirement of 3.3 million and a 2040 contribution of just under $4 million. So it does demonstrate that the goal has certainly worked, and we've also benefited significantly by the returns in fiscal year 21. And this is if nothing changed today. This would be the projected trend line if the city continued to see 6.5% investment returns annually. And I would just note that this flat line here is just representing that 5 years amortizing the gains from fiscal year 21. Now, curiously, I think it's interesting to note the pension subcommittee, when they looked at this chart last week, asked a really interesting question, which was, we see that this, difference in the early years is certainly more modest than the out years. So what is the quantification of that? And so here, if you look at January 16 to this January 25 date, those 9 years, 16 to 25, the city would be contributing $3.2 million more than they would have contributed following the blue line. The reason why I've asterisked that is that you also contributed the additional $500,000, which was in addition to this contribution requirement. So the total is really $3.7 million. And based on the current model, those additional contributions will save in the out years $25.5 million in actual contributions that would have been required from the property taxpayers. So we're very happy to be able to show you in print this model's working, it's effective, and has certainly served Lake Forest very well. So we're excited to see that result for sure. So the other item that the pension subcommittee has worked on over the last 5 years is the concept of closed versus open amortization. The statutes require a closed amortization period that is 40 years. And so that means the closer you get to the funding deadline of 2040, the more volatility you will see in contribution requirements as a result of fewer years to amortize that performance, that investment performance. And that is the reason why the General Assembly continues to extend this amortization period out, because the closer municipalities get to that, the more difficulty they have in funding the contribution requirements. Another way to handle this is using an open amortization approach, which says if you're using a 15-year open amortization, every year you're amortizing your liability over 15 years. It stays the same every year. The upside to that is less volatility in your contribution requirements. The downside of it is that if you follow a strict open amortization approach, you'll never reach 100% funded. And so the pension subcommittee over the last few years have recommended, and your pension funding policy reflects a goal to phase in an open amortization period when the contribution requirements under both scenarios are the same, and then flatline that contribution rather than reducing it to eventually get to 100%. So this model just updates the open versus closed. The orange line is what you saw on the previous slide. The green is if you went to 15-year open amortization today, you would see a significant increase in the first year of contributions, but effectively you would have phased it in and you could begin dropping contribution requirements. The other thing I would just note is that looking at the closed amortization period, the contribution requirement today of 3.3 million compares to a 2025 contribution of 3.17 million, effectively slightly smaller, but then you would start to see increasing contributions. So the goal is not to move to a full open amortization, but to instead phase it in and then maintain a constant contribution requirement and then eventually get to 100% funding. Another advantage of open amortization, which I think has been the overwhelming impact on the pension subcommittee in recommending the phase-in open amortization, is the impact on contribution requirements under closed versus open when your actual investment experience does not match your assumed rate of return. We use 6.5% currently. So this is a little extreme, but it's happened before. We modeled here a 6% return for 3 years, 21 to 23, just slightly under your assumed return of 6.5, but then a 22% loss in 24. And then you see these charts which depict under a closed amortization period, a very immediate and significant increase in the contribution requirement, again, because you're closer to that 2040 period. So you have less time to amortize that loss in investment return. And so that comes through in an increased contribution requirement. Whereas with an open amortization, that is going to re-amortize 15 years every year. That adjustment is going to be less severe, more modest, and occur over time rather than immediate. So that is another advantage and selling point for using the open amortization approach. So when the pension subcommittee met last week and reviewed the new modular information, we looked at two potential tax levies for police and fire pension. The left side here, and I will only draw your attention to the lines in yellow. You will talk about the levy overall later in your agenda, but just as a preview, you're seeing the entire thing. We focused on the police and fire pension levies. The actuarially determined contribution requirement is a slight decrease compared to last year when you're looking at remaining with the 100% closed amortization period. The results of the actuarial reports and the required contribution showed that the city could slightly reduce their contribution requirement for fiscal year 23. On the other side, on the right side, we looked at what would happen if the city added $250,000 to the police levy and $175,000 to the fire levy for two reasons. One, to continue this or to accelerate our phase in of open amortization, but also to consider the potential impacts on the contribution requirement next year with a reduced investment return assumption. So we have steadily over the last several years reduced our investment return assumption. We went from 7.5 to 7, and then to 6.75, and then to 6.5. And the pension subcommittee over the last couple of years has indicated a desire to potentially move further down, potentially to a 6.25 investment return assumption next year. So with those additional contributions, you can see on the bottom line, a difference in the tax levy increase from 1.29% over last year to 2.5% over last year. And so as a result of the meeting last week, the pension subcommittee recommendations are to increase the police levy by $250,000 and fire by $175,000 added to the actually determined contribution requirement in order to, again, accelerate the transition to 15-year open and anticipate a reduction of the interest rate assumption to 6.25 for 2022 valuations. So this is not requiring any approval from the committee this evening. This is mostly informational and an update. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about it. But this recommendation you'll see later in the agenda when you talk about the 2021 tax levy.
So that was quite a bit of information with a lot of detail, but I'm going to open up for questions from the members. And I'll scan my thing here to see if we get questions. There's a lot to think about, but we'll have time to kind of let it sink in and discuss it further as we get through the budget discussions over the next 6 weeks or so. Alderman
So
Rummel?
Director Holub, I have a question or just a comment. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the subcommittee on pensions that have gotten us in good stead in this liability, especially Tim Newman, who stayed on after leaving the council, who has quite a bit of investment management experience to help, kind of supplement you and the mayor and Jed. I think, just big picture, I'm really supportive of these recommendations. I would add a third bullet that it gives us a bit of a hedge to increase the funding because, if you think about wages from a 5.5% increase to 2%, And the fact that we are experiencing some inflation while others are maybe think it's transitory, there may be some wage pressures to keep the fine staff that we have in our community. And I guess I think it serves as a hedge in case we want to move from that 2% or have to move in terms of market conditions on that 2% to increase that, which then would obviously kind of ripple effect to the pension obligations. And so I'm very much in the support of that. And I'd also potentially counsel the subcommittee to do some sensitivity analysis on that wage assumption to see what the impact would be the next time they look at these things if we do have to move off that 2% assumption.
That's a good point. Good point.
So if I might, just for a moment, thank you, Alderman Preschlack, because I think that's an important point to bring up that, that I should have clarified on this slide. So in 2017, when we made these changes, this salary schedule change, we had originally been using a 5.5% salary increase assumption, which said we're going to assume everybody's salaries increase by 5.5% per year. And the actuary came back and said, actually, that's a little conservative because once your police officers reach full, their final tier, then they're really only getting, a compensation adjustment of 2.5 or around that per year. And so he recommended that we actually built in a service length salary schedule. And so what he does is for the newer police officers, we assume a higher percentage increase because they're getting step increases as well as a compensation adjustment. And then for the longer tenured patrol officers, we bring it back to more just the inflationary compensation adjustment. The payroll growth assumption here from 5.5 to 2% is that is the ramp that is created by the statutory funding formula. And so when you use payroll growth of 5.5, you're adding 5.5% per year on top of your salary adjustments. And so what the actuary was recommending was that the lower that payroll growth assumption is, that is what modifies your ramp trajectory. And so there was a lot of discussion about, reducing that from 5.5 to what? If you lower it to 0%, you're essentially on level amortization. So you're a straight line. You're going to amortize the same amount of the liability over the time. And so the pension subcommittee and then again, the council opted to lower it to 2% rather than going to level amortization, which was just a little bit too much than we could absorb for the increased contribution. So that 2% doesn't assume that our payroll will go up by 2%. It just assumes that we will contribute 2% above salary adjustments each year, and that creates the ramp.
Okay, yeah, so then the natural question is, just based on early service versus kind of term. So what's the blended salary increase? And is that, commiserate to market rates? And I mean, I guess, it sounds like it could be, and I still think it's good to be conservative to overfund these, but, I would just ask the subcommittee to, to take a look at that, given that costs of everything is moving up pretty high and inflation is
Sure.
It's going to be twofold in this capacity. It's going to mute our bond returns, and it's going to make this assumption be critical in how we think about funding this.
Yeah,
Right.
very good points. We'd definitely do that. Alderman Rummel, you had your hand raised?
Yes, I did. I just, those of us who came on the council in 2017 came in the midst of this crisis. And it's just very gratifying to see this played out over the years. I think it's myself and Alderman Morris and Alderman Bushman who have watched this from, I think, when we changed actuaries and sat down and had several special meetings over just this topic. And to see this now playing out and doing exactly what we projected it would do is just fabulous, and it really speaks to the expertise that we have on the council and that we have on that special police and fire pension committee, and just an incredible thank you to everyone who put their expertise behind giving us this terrific result. So thank you, and to Director Holub, who has led this, and I think you're advising the state pretty much on this at this point. Aren't you on a special committee for this?
Yeah, actually, it's on the consolidation question, yeah.
Yeah, so we have one of the foremost experts now advising us on our staff, and it just doesn't get any better than that. I did have just a sort of curious question, and this may have been answered before, but why is it that the police funding has consistently lagged behind the fire fund? Was there's some sort of historical reason for that?
So I will note that the funded ratio difference between the two plans goes back as far back as we have records. But my understanding is that I believe it's 1993 when the exposure to equities was increased for fire and police pension funds across the state. And my understanding is that fire was quicker to avail themselves of that new limit and got to see some of those significant equity increase returns in the 90s, that police was a little more conservative, and so they didn't reap the benefit of those early really good years.
Wow, it's just so interesting to see how that all plays out, compounded over the years, isn't it? I mean, just,
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
you kind of never catch up. Very interesting. Well, again, thank you. It's fabulous.
Okay. Alderman Bushman, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Alderman Rummel, for refreshing our recollection as to how this, had been a problem in the past and how it's been addressed, and the results that we're seeing here. And Alderman Preshlik, I agree with you that we need to keep an eye on the pressure on salaries and the inflation factor there. But one other component that obviously is a very significant component is investment return. And obviously the returns that Elizabeth shared with us, I guess it took us through March of this year, the 12 months, were quite good. And even if you amortize it over the last 3 or 5 years, you still show a return that exceeds the 6.5%. And just looking at the S&P 500 year to date, I see we're over 19% this year. So my question is, if the investment returns continue to be in that category, that level, which clearly exceed a 6.5% assumption rate, do we still want to give priority to providing further funds to this effort, recognizing there's a benefit in doing it, but obviously we need to have priorities in terms of where we put our money. But so the question goes, if we continue to see very good returns, that is this a plan that we still would want to pursue, or we want to modify it to reflect those higher returns?
Director Holub? Go ahead.
Yeah, Alderman Bushman, I think my sense from the pension subcommittee's discussion last week is that they felt that this increased contribution this year would put the city in all probability moving to open amortization in 2 years. And so I think it was just an opportunity to leverage the investment returns we got from fiscal year 21, make a modest increase to the tax levy, and really switch to that open amortization as of April 30, 2023, instead of April 30, 2025. So it would occur 3 years earlier and then essentially flatline those levy lines indefinitely.
But you do agree if the investment returns clearly exceed the 6.25 or 6.5, we get the additional benefit from that of
Yes,
earlier open amortization.
right.
Well, also, Elizabeth, maybe you can talk a little bit about how the model reacts. I think you had a slide about this earlier in your presentation. When there's a really strong investment performance, it reduces our funding requirement, almost immediately, as was the case, for the last fiscal year.
Right, it does. And I think that if we saw a fiscal year 22 return, above 6.5% again, I think we could very possibly be looking at that open amortization being put in place next year instead of 2 years from now.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on this because I dug up a memo August 30th, 2019 that you sent to us. And so Director Holub, I think it's really risky for us to fall into recency bias on 1 year. And, it becomes, well, how many years does it take to make a trend to change our investment assumptions? And our whole city fiscal and pension fund management has been conservative and kept us in good stead. But let me just give you a couple numbers here that will put this in perspective. On August 30th, 2019, Elizabeth Holub sent to the mayor and to the city council a memo on this very topic. And at that date, the 15-year average returns, 15-year trailing returns for police and fire, police was 5.72 and fire was 6.21. That's a 15%, that's 15-year returns less than the return assumption at the time, which was 6.75%. Okay, so as this is why we have a subcommittee with a professional and folks that don't use 1 year as a trend to change assumptions. And we look at from in the same packet of information in April 2012, our investment return assumption was 7.5. Next year later was 7.5, and then we went down to 7. We kept it at 7 the next 2 years, and then we went down to 6 and 3/4. Very prudent way to manage these assumptions on the investment return based on the investment climate with professionals. And in 2019, a 15-year average return was lower than our assumption. So I think it's really, really important to be deferential to our subcommittee of professionals and to be very judicious and not fall into recency bias and call for changes based on 1 year blips of returns, because past is not prelude. As we know, if you've been in the investment world and you've been a trustee or an investment manager over any single portfolio, past is not prelude.
Yeah, maybe I could just comment for the committee. There's that principle in investments that returns always regress to the mean, which is to say these outlier years where you have abnormal returns either above or beyond, eventually over time go right back to the mean. So we're trying to track to a mean of 6.25. We'll see if that we can even maintain that, as Alderman Preschlag said, but that was our conservative bias, Alderman Bushman. So
we also, in the course of the committee meeting, discussed what other entities, communities, municipalities, major public pension plans, what they are using for similar, for these assumptions going forward. And while you'll hear about Illinois having a couple of them that are still in the 7% range or even higher, that's actually a way to artificially reduce the view toward the liability. And by and large, we are tracking consistent at 6.5. We're consistent with sort of the middle range of comparable communities. 6.25 is rapidly becoming the standard.
Very good. Other questions from the committee? Let me scan my monitor here. If not, we'll have a chance to reflect on this and think about it and act on it in the future. But so there's no need to vote on this. It's advisory at this moment. So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Holub. Let's go on. We're at the 1 hour mark, so we want to keep moving. So.
Just a very quick update on public safety pension consolidation. Alderman Rummel mentioned that. So we are in the middle of consolidating investment assets of all the local fire and police pension funds into 2 state consolidated funds. And so I just wanted to let you know that the Fire Consolidated Fund completed their first tranche on October 1st. They transferred, I believe, 72 local pension funds into the Consolidated Fund, and Lake Forest Fire is included in the next tranche. And so we are working towards a November 1st date of having our fire investment assets transferred into the Consolidated Fund. Lake Forest Police isn't scheduled yet. The Police Consolidated Fund hasn't published their schedule. They anticipate doing tranches similar to fire, just a few months behind. I anticipate we're going to be December or January for the police. So just wanted to let you know that's in progress. And we'll move on, Chairman Morris, to the property tax levy estimate. You will talk about the property tax levy on 5 more dates. This just provides you the schedule. Under state statute, the council must approve a non-binding tax levy estimate. That is scheduled for the November 1st City Council meeting. And that's the subject of our discussion this evening. But then you will review the tax levy in detail as part of the November 8th budget workshop, City Council Finance Committee. You will potentially have first reading, scheduled to have first reading of the tax levy ordinance November 15th. And then consider final approval of the 2021 tax levy ordinance at your City Council meeting on December 6th. So quite a lot of discussion on the tax levy coming over the next several weeks. This is the similar slide to what you saw in the earlier pension section. You can see the individual line items of the city's property tax levy. A 1.4% is the PTEL limit applicable to those levy line items. So a number of these lines you see a 1.4% increase consistent with PTEL. New growth is included at the bottom. That is based on tax assessment data offered by the county. It's non-binding, but it's an estimate they provide us, and that would generate about $223,000 in additional revenue for new construction, new growth, and that is split between the general fund and library levy. And then you do see in yellow the pension subcommittee recommendation on the police pension and fire pension funding. Consolidating to the grand total at the bottom of an increase of 2.5% over the total adopted levy from last year. So happy to answer any questions you have. What we would be looking for this evening is just concurrence from the Finance Committee on whether or not this is the tax levy estimate that you would consider on November 1st, again, as a non-binding estimate. It's really to determine whether or not the city anticipates a levy increase of 5% or greater, which we clearly do not. Happy to answer any questions.
Questions from the members? I don't see any hands as I scan across my screen here. Oh, Alderman Rummel.
Well, so the new growth, that's really looking at new growth, what, a year ago or a year and a half, right?
Right.
Which, so we're going to at some point, probably see a pretty good bump in that, right? When things catch up.
Right.
Okay. Questions? I don't see any. So thank you. We'll obviously have many times to talk about this, but for purposes of Director Holub's mission, we'd like to get a affirmation of this from the city councils or from the members. So I need a motion to affirm her program.
So moved.
No second.
Aye.
Director Holub?
Certainly. All right, Mayor Pandeleon,
Aye.
Chairman Morris,
Aye.
Alderman Karas,
Aye.
Alderman Rummel,
Aye.
Alderman Notes,
Aye.
Alderman Preschlack,
Aye.
Alderman Gashgarian,
Aye.
Alderman Bushman,
Aye.
Alderman Weber.
Aye.
All right, thank you. I am now going to turn over the presentation to Assistant Finance Director Diane Hall. I just want to note as she presents this last component of COVID-19 related funding to the city, Diane has done a fantastic job of working with the operating departments to identify all eligible COVID-19 expenses and make sure that we're really maximizing the funding available to us from the different sources. So this is a new piece. You've been hearing a little bit about this the last few months, and Diane is going to walk you through the allocation and the current staff recommendation related to it. Diane?
All right, thank you. Next slide. Back in March of this year, funding was approved to add additional resources for local governments to assist with the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Cities were put into two different classifications. Those over 50,000, those received direct funding from the U.S. Treasury, and those under 50,000, such as the city, have been classified as non-entitlement communities. And those allocations were based on populations and were distributed directly through the state. Funding is going to be in two different payments, 50% now, and then the remaining 50% 1 year later. And the city's total allocation is 2.6 million, and we've received our first payment of 1.3 million. The U.S. Treasury has provided guidelines on the use of funds. It can be used for revenue replacement, but it's only the extent the reduction of revenue is directly impacted by COVID-19. As Elizabeth mentioned, we've been very diligent on already doing COVID expenditures, but eligible COVID-19 expenditures or negative impacts are also eligible uses. Premium pay for essential workers and investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure are also eligible based on capital projects. But there's also guidelines on what cannot be used for these funds. Directly or indirectly offset tax reductions are for taxes that have been delayed or tax increases, and they cannot be used to deposit into pension funds for to increase pension funding. So staff is recommending using a eligible capital project fund. This provides a great funding source out of the capital program for a long-term capital project. And the city is also required to certify that the use of the funds is an eligible purpose as outlined by the U.S. Treasury. And a single capital project also provides really easy tracking, and there are different reporting requirements the city will need to follow. And if the committee concurs, staff can bring a specific project recommendation to the November 8th capital budget workshop for discussion and consideration. Next. The city has been very active in pursuing assistance for COVID-related expenses. We've been filing through the city's liability agency, IRMA, received $2,500. Then the CARES Act through Lake County, we've received almost $900,000. And we did provide the library $50,000 for their eligible expenses. We've completed 2 FEMA applications for another 200,000. We have a 3rd FEMA application in the works. And we've already received the 1.3 million in ARPA funding. So we've received 2.4 million in COVID relief funding sources, and we will be receiving an additional 1.3 million next year. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Good. Questions from the members? I'm scanning my doesn't look that, oh, Alderman Rummel.
It's a question that we talked a little bit offline about. So is this like a 1-for-1 reimbursement, or do we stand to have a net gain out of all of these funds? Or, it would be interesting to see how our expenses stacked up related to the funds we've received as reimbursement. Is it 1-for-1, or?
Those we're capped. So for the Lake County distribution, we were capped at the $899,000, but we did have eligible expenditures that we did submit for reimbursement. The FEMA, those are direct expenses that are through the applicable FEMA regulations. So the ARPA would have to be a direct expense in relation to COVID-19 and an eligible project by the U.S. Treasury.
So, we should not look at this as a windfall. It's really reimbursement for expenses, basically. Is that what we're concluding?
The other ones, yes, the ARPA funds are to promote the community, to promote growth. So they're to provide benefits to the community, such as quality of water, which is a big item that they've discussed in the regulations.
Oh, interesting. So they're also encouraging investment in certain almost infrastructure programs, basically, right?
Yes.
Interesting. Thank you.
Very good. Questions from other members? Any? If not, the director has asked that we provide an affirmation of the recommendation to spend the ARPA funds on an eligible capital project, and for the staff to provide a specific recommendation for consideration at the November 8th capital workshop in our budgetary process.
Are we talking about one project, or are we talking about several projects?
I think it's one project that we would recommend, but I'll let Director Holub answer that question.
Yes, Alderman Rummel, we are more inclined to offer one project that the city, one of the 1NF projects, only because of the reporting requirements that Diane talked about. The more you spread these across smaller projects, then that becomes pretty arduous reporting that we need to do to the federal government. And so for simplicity's sake, it would be great to do a single project that's eligible. Again, we're going to be looking at water or sanitary sewer or storm sewer are the 3 significant areas where we can do capital projects with ARPA funding.
Okay.
Alderman Morris.
Yes.
Excuse me, it's Alderman Weber.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Following up on Alderman Rummel's comment, could Director Holub, could you offer us a choice perhaps between 2 equal opportunity projects? I just be curious, if I'm sure there's a lot of things we can spend this money on, but if there maybe are 2 that are equally desirable that maybe the council could vote at the next meeting.
Sure, absolutely. We can bring back on November 8th kind of maybe the suite of projects we looked at and how we narrowed it down to a particular recommendation, so that if you feel it's more appropriate to do an alternate project, we'll be able to do that.
Thank you.
Or perhaps we would say we really think we need to do 2 projects. So I'm wondering if maybe this motion should be a little bit more general and we can refine it when I don't have anything in particular in mind, but I just hate to tie us into that when we haven't even seen the list of projects that we're talking about.
Right, sure.
Well, just can I make a comment? You know, any dollars that go into a project are dollars that are now available for another project. I mean, these ARPA dollars are manna from heaven. And so, for example, if you kind of do some back of the envelope math, between the state funding that we're looking at and this 2.6 million, that essentially covers the entire Burr Oak project, for example, and that frees up $5.2 million for other projects that could be spread around however we want. So, and there's a great deal of just sort of administrative efficiency, because when you're dealing with the government, the simpler you keep it, the less trouble you're going to have. So that's just I think that's Elizabeth's thinking, and it's money that would, I mean, dollars are fungible. For example, we're not allowed to spend it on pensions, but if we don't have to spend it on Burr Oak, then we can put Burr Oak money into it's just, it all evens out. So
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I get it. Yeah.
Okay, other questions? So not sure who brought it up, but let me amend what we'd like in the form of an emotion. And that's the affirmation to spend ARPA funds on eligible capital projects, plural, and to have the staff provide specific project recommendations, plural, for consideration at the November 8th Finance Committee Budget Workshop.
So moved.
Second.
Second. Dr. Holub?
Thank you, Mayor Panelian,
aye.
Chairman Morris,
Aye.
Alderman Karas,
Aye.
Alderman Rummel,
Aye.
Alderman Notes,
Aye.
Alderman Preschlack,
Aye.
Alderman Gashgarian,
Aye.
Alderman Bushman,
Aye.
and Alderman Weber.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion approved, and we will bring that back on November 8th.
So Elizabeth will have a short presentation on item 7, investment program recommendations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman Morris. And in the interest of time, if any of these are problematic, we can certainly wait and bring these to you on a future agenda. Nothing this evening under this item is time critical. And it's just simply moving us closer and closer towards the investment program foundation that we're looking to try to implement. We talked earlier this evening about interest rates and what the city can and can't earn on its funds right now. One thing to note specifically is that the money that we're talking about today is not fire or police pension money, and it is not cemetery commission money. It's everything else. And everything else has very specific limitations under state statute on how we can invest it. And so this chart really illustrates for you a wide breadth of the opportunities that we currently have to invest funds in. And you can see that this chart taps out at 1%. So none of the items really provide for us any significant additional yield at the current time. And it's been this way for a while. And that has really been the challenge in developing this investment program because rates are so low. And so what you have here is really the spectrum from the left to the right is risk. And so the less risky options are to the left, the more risky options are to the right. And then the gradient is intended to reflect a time element. So these three to the left, Lake Forest Bank and Trust, IMET Convenience Fund, and Illinois Funds are all immediate liquidity. All of that money is available to us all of the time. And then these out here in the right side, this IMET 1 to 3 year fund and iPrime, that has some limited ability for us on IMET 1 to 3, I believe is a 5 business day liquidity, and iPrime is a quarterly liquidity. So still reasonable, and we can plan for that, but you can see even that isn't going to match our current yield on our deposits at 0.39 currently. These middle columns in here, these are all solid because they're the longer term threshold. So this here is a 4-year certificate of deposit, a 5-year certificate of deposit, a 3-year treasury, and a 4-year treasury. So you can see that, you know, locking up city money for 3 to 5 years is going to generate this kind of return. So there really is little opportunity for us. We cannot invest these at 25 to 27% because we don't have the vehicles available to us to do that. And so that's always important to understand that this is really, really different from the conversation that we've had about the pension funds earlier today. So we had included this evening 3 items. One is your investment policy. And we just brought this all together as a package because it was investment related. A few years ago, the state did pass the Illinois Sustainable Investing Act and posed a challenge to municipalities to add sustainable investing to an element in their investment policy. It is not required, it is only recommended. And it has no impact on our current investment practices, and it's unlikely to impact us in the foreseeable future based on the nature of the investments that we can invest in. I did reflect on this over the weekend and thought that it would be appropriate to make one small change to the additional language that we recommended. I included shall. I think it would be appropriate to change that to may. And again, it really just sets forth the factors that may or may not impact future investment activity of the city. And that was the sole recommended change to the investment policy. The second involves segmentation. So under our investment policy and our investment procedures manual, we must determine the segmentation of our cash assets into a liquidity segment and a core segment. The liquidity segment being the portion that is going to be short-term in nature and provide funds to meet immediate funding needs. The core segment is the segment that can be invested more long-term, can be tied up for a period of time to obtain additional yield because those dollars aren't anticipated to be needed in the near future. So the finance team, specifically Diane and myself, have gone through all of the city's funds, and based on the revenue generating capability, the existing fund balance reserves, the long-term financial forecast from a budget perspective on drawing down those reserves were all examined. And then we put those funds in different groupings here in this table to reflect our recommendation for segmentation of the city's portfolio. It does not mean anything will happen tomorrow. It just means that this is our general sense by fund of how much would be available for long-term assets and what portion of the assets need to remain short-term and liquid for the city's purposes. And then I just included some notes to just kind of offer our theory, our thoughts on why we made the particular recommendations that we did. We did arrange to allow flexibility, and also we did this with an eye on the long term, with the thought that we would not make fluctuations in this each year. This would be a range that we would generally feel would be appropriate over at least a five-year period. And lastly, the additional element that will round out our investment program is determining benchmarks for investment reporting. Again, we have no investments today. Don't anticipate them for the foreseeable future, but when we do, we will provide investment reporting monthly to the Finance Committee. And so we looked at different benchmarks. We looked at the type of investments that we thought we would be investing in the liquidity and core segments, and offered you independent, reportable benchmarks that would give you a reference point to compare our actual performance to relatable benchmarks in in the world of investment. So we offered 3 for the liquidity segment to give you kind of a blend of different investment products we might purchase in the future with the liquidity segment assets. And then we offered 2 with the core segment. We are authorized to make investments in corporate bonds. We don't anticipate moving there in the near future. But if we did begin to invest in corporate bonds, I think we'd come back with a 3rd benchmark that would be specific to that additional credit risk as a benchmark if we had corporate bonds in our portfolio. So those are the 3 recommendations. Again, happy to answer questions and also happy to just let you digest this and bring it back at a future meeting.
So Elizabeth, as you just stated, since this is time sensitive, we can defer voting on the affirmation of these 3 elements in the policy recommendations. Is that correct?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Okay. Questions from the members?
Hey, Elizabeth, Jim Prushack. So it seems like it's really a trade-off between liquidity and I guess there's different credit risk profiles, but it's all fixed income. And I just, if we're in 39 basis points and we're giving up liquidity, which has some optionality, right? If we need the funds to do certain things, so there's a cost to that liquidity. I'm just kind of curious, what the incremental yield would be on the proposed asset allocation that you just went through. And, that's how I think about it. It's like we're getting we're possibly getting 60 more basis points or 50 more basis points, which translates to X amount a year. But we're giving up some liquidity to, put some money across these funds potentially that are restricted to do certain things. That's as an executive, that's how I think we should think about this. So I'm just kind of curious what your reaction is to that.
Right. Alderman Prushack, my thought is that initially we would probably move into pools because we retain the liquidity. We can get a little bit of additional yield on the return, but we haven't locked up dollars at a low interest rate in treasuries or certificates of deposit. I have a hard time purchasing a 3 to 5 year product at a fixed interest rate so low when I can let that just stay in Lake Forest Bank and Trust. It's 110% collateralized. There's no risk at all. And that rate is going to rise as interest rates rise. So it's that element of fixing that low rate and then potentially give it back as rates rise on what we could have earned in Lake Forest Bank and Trust.
Yeah, that's perfect. I totally agree with that. So thank you.
Great. Comments or questions? If not, we'll move on with the expectation that we will do this affirmation for the director in a future meeting. Just moving on in our agenda, the other business is the informational items, which is the September 2021 flash report and the FY 2021 treasury report. Any questions or comments on those items? No.
I'd like to hear Elizabeth just give us a 10-second snapshot on real estate transactions.
Well, you can see we've started to slow down just a hair, not a lot. I think we're now reaching our year of, kind of the boom that we saw. So it's going to be interesting to see how we trend now going forward compared to last year. But we certainly still remain active and the sale prices are still up there. So it's very encouraging. We typically do slow down over the winter though.
And we've got a couple of commercial transactions in the marketplace, as I recall, right?
Possibly, not that I'm aware of at the current time. We had a couple buildings in Conway change hands a couple months ago and saw a commercial transfer. But I don't know. That would be good news if
I think there are two Conway owners who have said that once they complete some transitions of office space, that they're going to be putting couple of those buildings on the market.
Fabulous. Good to know.
I think there are two. So
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This gets us to the opportunity for the public to address the Finance Committee. And as usual, there's a call-in number, which is on the screen, 847-810-3643, or you can raise your hand and type in a question. So we'll give everyone a couple minutes, well, maybe a minute or so to, since we're behind time, to make their call or raise their hand. While we're waiting, I would just say that the next meeting will be Monday, November 8th, and it's a 5 o'clock start. So it's a workshop as opposed to a formal Finance Committee meeting. It's the workshop to begin the budgetary discussions. So I'm sure that's in your calendars at this point.
Mr. Chairman, we don't have any phone calls at the moment. However, we do have a raised hand in the audience.
Okay.
Sorry. My name is Rami Lopat. I do have a question. Not too long ago, the city approved, I do believe, a request from a not-for-profit, Ragdale, to borrow money from the city and thus give us back a rate of interest that we might not be otherwise getting in the marketplace. Does the city council, could the city council address that to a greater degree and talk about whether it would widen up the potential ability to have other requesters do the same thing?
Well, thank you, Romy. Let me turn that back to Director Holub for a response, and perhaps the mayor as well.
Sure. Specific to Ragdale, just let everyone know, we continue to have discussions with them, bringing, several items back for council approval. They do have a draft loan agreement. They are reviewing it. They've not provided comments back on the draft just yet. But I believe we are planning to bring the last of the Ragdale items, including the loan, to the council at your meeting in December.
Mayor Pantalone, any comments you want to add to?
I guess, I guess the notion that the city would get in the lending business for the purpose of arbitraging interest rates is probably not something we would consider. These are operating funds, essentially. This is available cash. However, we have a long history of making, loans to worthy institutions, oftentimes where the city is the actual owner of the property, like with Ragdale, where it's the interest rate arbitrage is a bit of a side benefit. It really isn't the reason why we're doing it. We're doing it to facilitate the expansion of Ragdale, and I anticipate we'll do that again with other institutions when they have worthy projects and need a little assistance in terms of generating the cash resources necessary to further the institutional interest. But no, we don't do that as a way to make money per se. It has the benefit of generating a little higher interest rate than we would otherwise get on our available cash. But that's not a business that we should get into, in my opinion. I don't think we've really seriously entertained that. So.
Thank you. Are there any other raised hands or call-ins at this moment?
Mr. Chairman, we have no other callers at the moment.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to adjournment, which I'm happy to offer a motion or accept a motion for adjournment of the Finance Committee meeting with the expectation that we would return in about 5 minutes after a bio break.
I move to adjourn.
Second? We need a second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those against? None? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. There's a lot to cover tonight.